Three girls disappeared on what was supposed to be the happiest summer of their lives. But decades later, the ocean revealed a truth their families never expected. In 1992, three inseparable friends vanished during a seaside vacation. 30 years later, a battered wooden box washed ashore, carrying the key to their mystery. For decades, families searched, detectives wondered, and a town lived with unanswered questions. What happened on that summer night? Why did no one hear their cries? And how did the ocean, after all these years, bring back the memory they tried so hard to preserve? This is the story of friendship, silence, and the long journey to closure. It was the summer of 1992 in Willow Bay, a seaside town where laughter mixed with the sound of gulls and the crashing of waves. The air smelled of fried dough from boardwalk stands, and the horizon shimmered gold beneath a July sun. Among the tourists and families, three girls walked together, as if bound by one heartbeat. Lena Carter, 16, with her camera swinging against her hip; Maya Flores, 15, clutching her sketchbook, always lost in her own drawings; and Hannah Reed, bold and full of fire, daring the other two into games and adventures. They were inseparable. Locals remembered their laughter echoing across the beach, their shadows stretching together across the pier. People said you could never see one without the other. That day they spent hours in the tide pools, daring each other to wade deeper, collecting shells, scribbling notes in the sand that the tide quickly erased. It was a day of sunlight and freedom, one of those days that feels endless when you're young. That evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, Lena lifted her camera. She caught the three of them locked arm in arm, the sky painted orange behind them. Hannah laughed and said they should bury a time capsule somewhere on the beach. And if we don't come back to open it, she teased, maybe the ocean will open it for us. None of them knew those words would echo years later, in ways they could never imagine. When they returned to their cabins that night, it all felt ordinary. Maya promised her sister Clara she'd bring back saltwater taffy in the morning. Lena teased her younger brother for sneaking into her bag to steal her film rolls. Hannah's mother reminded her to be careful near the cliffs. Normal words, small moments. But after that night, none of those promises or warnings would be spoken again. By dawn, the girls were gone. Their rooms untouched, their belongings neatly in place, their beds unslept in. Families called their names across the boardwalk, their voices breaking with panic, but there was no answer. And as we begin this journey together, I want you to pause for a moment. Think of the last time you said goodbye to someone without realizing it would be the final time. What do you think could silence three girls in a single night? Share your first thought in the comments below. Because that morning, laughter was replaced with silence, a silence that still echoes through Willow Bay. The morning of July 18, 1992, began like any other in Willow Bay. Families drifted down to the boardwalk for breakfast, coffee cups steaming in the cool sea air. But three cabins remained unnervingly still. Their curtains were drawn. No footsteps crossed the gravel path. No girls ran down the steps laughing and carrying their beach bags. At first, their families thought the friends had woken early, gone exploring. Hannah was known for her daring streak. Lena never let a morning pass without snapping a picture of the sunrise. Maya loved sketching alone when the tide was low. But as hours passed, unease tightened. The girls' shoes were still lined neatly by the door, their swimsuits folded in drawers. Maya's sketchbook sat untouched on her pillow, open to a half-finished drawing of the pier. By noon, worry turned into panic. Parents split up, calling their names up and down the boardwalk. Their voices grew hoarse in the salt air. "Lena! Maya! Hannah!" Shopkeepers shook their heads. No one had seen them that morning. The ice cream vendor swore he hadn't served them. A fisherman claimed he thought he'd seen 3 girls walking toward the cliffs before dawn, but he wasn't sure. The police were called by mid-afternoon. Detective Samuel Grayson, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, arrived with his small-town force. He later said he could still remember the look in the mother's eyes, that helpless fear that no parent ever wants to feel. He said it was like the tide had just swallowed them whole. By evening, Willow Bay was a scene of chaos. Search parties fanned out along the shoreline. Helicopters thudded overhead, sweeping spotlights across the cliffs. Volunteers trudged through dunes and marshes, calling until their voices cracked. Posters were stapled to telephone poles. Before the night was over, the 3 girls' smiling faces already fading in the glare of streetlights. But there were no footprints in the sand, no torn clothing, no notes left behind. It was as if 3 living, breathing teenagers had simply stepped out of existence. Theories began almost immediately. Some whispered the girls had run away. Others feared they'd been lured into a stranger's car. Hannah's father insisted no. His daughter was bold, yes, but she was loyal. Lena's mother swore her girl would never abandon her camera, which was found carefully zipped inside its bag. And Maya's quiet drawings spoke of a child who loved home, who loved her sister. Detective Grayson pressed on every lead. He knocked on motel doors, interviewed every vendor, questioned every fisherman. Nothing. I kept telling myself, he said years later, that kids don't just vanish. There has to be a trail. But the trail wasn't just cold. It was never there to begin with. Open questions haunted the town. If they had gone to the cliffs, why were there no tracks? If they had run into the sea, why was there no sign of struggle, no clothing washed ashore? And why, hours before their disappearance, had Hannah spoken about burying a time capsule in the sand? Did she know something? Or was it just a teenager's passing thought? The investigation stretched into weeks. Dogs were brought in, but the scents faded in the salt air. Boats scoured the bay, sonar pings echoing across the water. A diary page found in Lena's drawer hinted at a secret plan, but it ended mid-sentence. The families prayed it was a teenage joke. The police feared otherwise. By the end of the summer, Willow Bay was exhausted. The posters curled at their corners. The volunteers stopped showing up. The ocean continued its rhythm, endless and indifferent. The search ended officially that September. But in truth, the questions never ended. The search would end, but the questions never did. The summer of 1992 ended in mourning. School opened that September with 3 empty desks at the front of the classroom. Photographs of Lena, Maya, and Hannah were taped to lockers, their edges curling with the damp air. For weeks, children whispered their names as if saying them too loudly might summon the same fate. Parents kept their own children closer. Curfews were tightened, and an invisible shadow stretched across Willow Bay. Life went on, but never the same. The boardwalk, once filled with laughter, grew quieter. The cabins where the girls had stayed were rented less often. Even the ice cream shop saw fewer customers, as though joy itself felt inappropriate in the place where 3 young lives had disappeared without explanation. For the families, time seemed to stand still. Lena's mother left her daughter's room untouched, camera bags still zipped at the foot of the bed. Maya's sketchbooks were carefully stacked on her desk, pencil shavings still in the tray. Hannah's father oiled her bicycle chain every spring, even though no one would ride it again. Each gesture a refusal to let go. Detective Grayson kept the case files stacked in a locked drawer at the station. He revisited them year after year, convinced that a single overlooked clue might break everything open. There had to be something, he would mutter, leafing through photographs of the search parties, the diary fragment, the map of the cliffs. But nothing new ever surfaced. The trail, if it had ever existed, remained invisible. In 1999, 7 years after the disappearance, Grayson stood on the pier and admitted defeat. He retired soon after, telling a local paper that he had never worked a case so hollow, so absent of trace. Even in retirement, he kept the girls' photos on his desk at home. Friends said he carried their absence with him until his last days. The town marked anniversaries quietly. Some years candles were placed at the cliff's edge. Other years wreaths were set adrift on the tide. But as decades passed, the rituals faded. New generations grew up knowing the story only as a local legend. Visitors asked about the Willow Bay girls with a hushed curiosity, as if they were ghosts rather than 3 teenagers who once ran barefoot through the sand. For the families, though, time was cruelly static. Every birthday, every graduation season, every Christmas carried the same piercing reminder: what was missing. "You learn to breathe around the silence," Maya's mother once said, her voice fragile but steady. By the early 2000s, Willow Bay felt like it had been sealed in amber. Progress touched other towns, new shops, bright marinas, bustling tourism, but here the atmosphere seemed paused. The mystery had rooted itself so deeply that it was part of the air, part of the water. For 3 decades, nothing shifted, no new answers, only the same echoing question: how can 3 girls vanish without leaving even a ripple? And then, after 30 years of silence, the ocean spoke again. On a wind-swept evening in late September, 30 years after the girls had vanished, Willow Bay was battered by heavy rains and violent waves that clawed at the coastline. Locals braced their shutters and pulled their boats further inland, muttering that this storm felt different, angrier somehow, as if the sea itself was intent on giving something back. When the storm cleared the next morning, the shoreline was littered with debris. Seaweed clung to the rocks, branches tangled in the sand. And half buried in a dune near the old pier, a weathered wooden box, swollen from years of salt water, waited to be seen. A fisherman spotted it first. He described later that he almost passed it by, thinking it was driftwood. But something about the way the metal hinges caught the sun made him pause. He tugged at it, pried it open, and froze. Inside were items that did not belong to the sea. A faded leather journal, pages blurred but still legible. A sketchbook filled with drawings of faces and seaside cliffs. And a silver bracelet engraved with the name Maya. Within hours, word spread through Willow Bay. The families, now older, grayer, more fragile, were called in to identify the objects. They gathered in the small community center where the box had been placed on a long table, each item carefully laid out under protective glass. Lena's brother was the first to speak. He tapped the journal with trembling fingers. "That handwriting, it's hers," his voice cracked. "That's my sister." Maya's mother held the bracelet, clutching it as though it might dissolve in her palm. "I gave this to her for her 15th birthday," she whispered. Tears streaked her cheeks as she pressed it to her lips. And Hannah's father turned the sketchbook slowly, page by page. On one sheet, there was a charcoal sketch of the 3 girls together, smiling. On another, an unfinished drawing of the cliffs they loved to explore. He nodded once, silent, before closing the book. For the first time in 3 decades, the families had something tangible, something beyond fading memories and unanswered questions. Yet with the hope came unease. Why had these objects survived when the girls had not? Who had placed them in the box, and why had the ocean kept it hidden for so long? Detectives reopened the cold case, this time with new forensic methods unavailable in the 1990s. The journal was sent to a lab to test for fingerprints or DNA traces. The sketchbook was photographed page by page, archived digitally to prevent further degradation. The bracelet was examined for wear patterns, whether it had been taken off voluntarily or forcibly. Detective Alvarez, now leading the case, spoke carefully to the press. "We cannot say yet what these items mean, but we can say this: the girls were here. They left their mark." For the families, cautious hope mingled with dread. "It's like the tide gave us a gift," Lena's sister said softly. "But it's also a reminder. They're still out there, somewhere, waiting to be found." And if you've been following along to this point, friends, it's worth pausing for a moment. Stories like this remind us why persistence matters, why we keep searching even when decades pass. If you believe these girls deserve their truth, make sure you're subscribed. It helps us continue telling the stories that might otherwise be forgotten. Because here, in Willow Bay, the discovery of one small box had just reopened the door to one of the most haunting mysteries of the last century. But every clue raised another question, questions only the past could answer. The journal was fragile, its leather cover stiff with salt, its pages curling as though they had fought for decades against the sea. Under gloved hands, archivists began the painstaking process of separating each page with thin sheets of glass. What emerged wasn't just ink on paper, it was the girls' voices carried across 30 years. The first entries were innocent. Notes about school, about music they wanted to listen to when they got back from their trip, about silly arguments over who got to use the hairbrush first. But then the tone shifted. One entry, dated only 2 days before the girls vanished, described a storm. "Waves taller than houses. We thought the cliffs would break apart. Maya says she saw a light in the distance, flickering near the rocks. We followed it, even though we were scared. It wasn't a lighthouse. It was something else." The next pages revealed a discovery. A hidden cove, marked with a small hand-drawn map tucked inside the journal. The drawing was rough, but clear enough to show a crescent-shaped inlet shielded by jagged cliffs. Beneath the sketch, a line written in shaky handwriting. "We found a cave. It smells like the ocean is breathing." Detectives enlarged the map and overlaid it with satellite imagery. To their surprise, the contours matched a rarely explored stretch of coast, dangerous and inaccessible except during low tide. Forensic teams scanned the pages for fingerprints, but years of water damage left only faint smudges. Still, the handwriting analysis confirmed it. The entries belonged to Lena, the quietest of the three who rarely spoke but apparently wrote everything down. The entries grew darker. "We heard voices in the cave last night. Maybe fishermen, maybe not. Hannah swore someone was watching us. Maya wanted to leave, but the tide trapped us." And then the words stopped. The final page ended mid-sentence. "If anyone ever finds this, please," followed by nothing but smeared ink and a rip in the paper, as though the journal had been closed too quickly or snatched away. Families wept quietly as the passages were read aloud in a controlled room at the sheriff's office. Maya's mother gripped her daughter's bracelet and whispered, "She was afraid. She needed us." Detective Alvarez took a slow breath before addressing the press again. "We don't know if these were the girls' last words, but we know they were close. They were leaving us a trail, and we're following it." Open loops deepened rather than closed. Who had lit that flickering light? Why was the journal found sealed in a box instead of washed away entirely? And what or who had silenced Lena before she could finish her plea? The journal's secrets didn't end the mystery. They sharpened it. They pulled everyone closer to the truth while pushing them further into dread. The girls had left a trail, one the tide itself had tried to erase. The map from Lena's journal led investigators to a desolate stretch of coastline. It was a place locals avoided, sheer cliffs dropping into a churning sea, tides that could turn paths into death traps within minutes. On a gray morning, Detective Alvarez stood at the overlook, staring down at the jagged rocks below. "This is it," he said softly. "This is where they were trying to tell us to look." Forensic teams had already surveyed the inlet. Using sonar and ground-penetrating radar, they identified an opening at the base of the cliff. The entrance was barely visible except at the lowest tide, when the sea pulled back just far enough to reveal a shadowed gap. Divers had to time their descent to the minute, knowing the tide would close the door again. Inside, the cave was vast, its walls slick with salt and seaweed. Flashlights revealed a high chamber where the tide line stopped just short of the ceiling. Here, the silence was heavy, broken only by the drip of water echoing against stone. What they found inside matched the journal. Charcoal marks on the wall suggested someone had tried to track days, or perhaps tides. A piece of torn fabric, faded but intact, matched the style of jackets the girls had been wearing in 1992. And in one corner, lodged under a collapsed slab of rock, they found the unmistakable outline of a small satchel. The cave told the rest of the story. In the summer of 1992, the storm had driven them toward the cliffs. They must have seen the flickering light Lena described, a reflection perhaps from a fisherman's lamp caught on the waves, and followed it into the inlet. Once inside, the tide cut them off. By the time they realized it, it was too late to climb back out. The journal revealed their hope, their fear, their attempt to wait out the storm, but the cave itself revealed their fate. A collapse had sealed the back passage, leaving only the front opening, which vanished each time the tide surged in. Alvarez crouched near the charcoal marks, his gloved hand brushing the air just above them. "They were leaving signs," he murmured. "They wanted to be found." The twist came not from foul play, as many in town had long suspected, but from something more haunting: nature itself. All those years of rumors about abduction, about strangers seen in town, were shadows that obscured the truth. The ocean had been both refuge and prison. Families were brought to the site one by one, not inside, the cave was too unstable, but to the overlook above. There, with the wind in their hair and the roar of the sea beneath, detectives explained what had been discovered. Tears mixed with sea spray as parents listened. Some cried openly, others stood silent, fists clenched at their sides. "They weren't taken," Alvarez told them gently. "They weren't forgotten. They tried to leave us a trail. And in the end, we found it." The narrative had shifted. For 30 years, suspicion had poisoned the community. Neighbors blamed neighbors. Whispers turned to accusations. But the cave stripped those shadows away. The tragedy was real, but so was the dignity of knowing the truth. The ocean had not been their captor, but their final witness. The discovery at the cave did not end the story. For the families, it began a new chapter, one where answers finally replaced questions, but where grief, long held in check, was free to surface. On a clear autumn afternoon, they gathered in the town hall overlooking the harbor. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, warming the wooden floors where generations had once danced at festivals and held community meetings. Now the space was hushed, filled with the weight of memory. Detective Alvarez spoke first, not as an officer, but as a neighbor. "We chased shadows for decades. Today we know the truth. Your daughters, your sisters, Your friends, they were not taken by human hands. They were caught in a storm, seeking refuge where none could last. And yet they left us a story, a trail of courage and hope. Silence hung in the room, broken only by stifled sobs. For many, this was the first time grief had a shape. Clara, once a childhood friend of the girls, now in her 40s, stood near the back. Her eyes were wet but steady. "When we were kids," she whispered to the woman beside her, "we swore we'd grow up and travel together. I thought maybe one day they'd walk back through town. Now I know they never could." Nearby sat Tommy, the younger brother of one of the missing. He had built his life in the shadow of absence, carrying the unspoken duty of being the one who remained. He looked down at his hands, rough from years of fishing, and finally said aloud what he had held inside. "I blamed myself for not walking them home that day. 30 years I've carried that weight. But it wasn't me. It wasn't anyone. It was the sea." As each family took their turn to speak, something unexpected unfolded. Where once suspicion had divided neighbors, each wondering if another had hidden some terrible secret, there was now a tentative unity. Shared loss softened the sharp edges of old blame. A mother reached for the hand of another across the aisle. Fathers exchanged quiet nods. In the corner, a small display case held the artifacts recovered: the bracelet, the sketchbook, fragments of fabric. Families approached one by one, touching the glass as if the items themselves still held warmth. "They left us their words," Clara said when she reached the case, her hand hovering over the journal. "That's more than some families ever get. They wanted to be remembered, and now we do." Outside, the harbor bells tolled the hour. The sound drifted through the hall, mingling with the rustle of coats as people rose. No one rushed to leave. Closure had its own pace, slow, heavy, but certain. That evening, families gathered at the cliffside, where the ocean spread endlessly before them. They brought flowers, small lanterns, and the quiet resolve of people who had waited too long for truth. When the tide pulled back, lanterns were set upon the water, glowing briefly before the waves carried them away. Clara watched until hers was only a pinprick of light against the horizon. They'll never be just a story. They'll always be part of us. Closure, though late, is never small. It ripples across generations. The cove that once held only whispers of loss became a place of remembrance. Weeks after the discovery, townspeople and families returned, not with searchlights or questions, but with stone and wood, with hands steady in their grief. At the mouth of the cave, overlooking the restless tide, a small memorial took shape. A plaque was set into the rock face. It bore the names of the 3 girls and a line chosen by their families. They walked with courage into the storm, and they are not forgotten. Detective Grayson stood apart as the final pieces were laid. His coat tugged in the wind, the sea spray on his face. For him, the case had stretched across nearly half of his career. Files thick with theories, false leads, and unanswered calls. He had promised the families he would not let it fade. Now, with the memorial in place, he felt both relief and a quiet ache. He whispered to himself, "The ocean didn't take them in cruelty. It bore witness, and at last it gave them back." As lanterns were lit once again, Grayson found himself speaking to a young girl who had helped carry flowers. She was no relation to the missing, just a town child, curious about the memorial. "Why do we remember people we never knew?" she asked.
Grayson smiled softly. Because remembering makes us better. Their story teaches us not just what was lost, but what we hold on to. Hope, love, and the will to keep searching when answers seem impossible. The girl nodded, her small hand resting against the plaque as though to anchor the words in her heart. The camera of memory pulled back then, not only from the cove, but across the generations of families changed by the storm. Clara, Tommy, and others who had lived in absence now carried something else. Not the gnawing uncertainty of what had happened, but the clarity to move forward. Some would plant trees. Others would tell the story to their children, making sure it was not swallowed by time. And for the town itself, the tragedy became not a scar, but a landmark, a reminder of resilience born from sorrow. As the tide rolled in and out, the memorial stood firm against the salt and wind. The cave was silent again, sealed by nature, but its silence no longer mocked. It kept a vigil, a reminder that truth, though late, had returned. And so the tide carried back the truth. But what truths still wait hidden beneath its waves?